Alright, this presentation will cover Chapter 19, Section 1 and 2, pages 454 to 464. And as you can see, it's titled The American West. We'll be looking at roughly 1860 to 1900. We've finished with the Reconstruction era. We're going to be leaving life in the eastern part of the United States, and we're going to be heading west because that's where millions of Americans are headed now too. This shows you a map of the United States in the mid-1860s. You can see the whole central part of the United States is unclaimed territory. Most Americans at the time thought that that was kind of uninhabitable land. They called it the Great American Desert. It had a very dry climate, grasslands, desert mountains. They didn't think anyone could really live very successfully in that area, and they thought most of that land was just empty territory. They were soon going to find out that that was not the case, that there are thousands of Native Americans living in that area, which is of course going to cause conflict between them and the new settlers that are going to be trying to take up all the land in that area. And we'll be looking at the conflicts with the Native Americans in the next section. So there are four main economic opportunities in the West. There's railroad construction, ranching, farming, and mining, and we're going to be looking at each of these in a little more detail. First, the railroad. We've read about in previous chapters how important railroads are, not only for moving people, but also for moving products. And now that people are expanding into the West, there's going to be a need for railroads in that area as well, especially connecting California, which has been a state for several years now, with the rest of the country on the East Coast. So railroads are going to be very important. Some of the opportunities that railroads present are, of course, jobs, lots and lots of jobs available. The hardships, though, it's very dangerous and exhausting work, and competition for jobs kept wages pretty low, so you didn't make a whole lot of money working on the railroad. What also happened during this period is Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act, which gave public land to the railroad, who then used it to either lay tracks on, or if they weren't using it for a rail line, they were selling it to farmers. So the railroad companies got a huge profit off of selling land that wasn't going to be used. But it shows you that all these new railroad lines are going to be built across the country now. They're heading from east to west. The first transcontinental railroad, and transcontinental means across the whole continent. There was the Central Pacific that started in Omaha and were laying track heading west, and then there was the Union Pacific, which started over in the Sacramento area and were heading east. And they were in a contest with one another as to who could kind of reach the middle point, and Promontory Point in Colorado was considered the middle point, who could kind of get there first. If you look on the map, you can see that from Omaha to Promontory Point, they had to build a lot more track. They covered more ground, but they had the advantage because it was mostly flat ground. The Union Pacific, from Sacramento to the middle point, they had to go through the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountains, which obviously is a lot more difficult and a lot more labor intensive. And the groups of people that helped with that were Chinese people. There were thousands of Chinese people who came to the United States in that area, and they did the really difficult work of dynamiting through the mountains and laying the tracks through that very difficult area. But they came together at Promontory Point. This is the famous photograph from that. If you can see kind of in the middle, there's two men shaking hands, each representing the two different rail lines. But it was completed in 1869, so it took under 2 years to build the railroad, but now we've connected the west coast to the east coast through this, and at Promontory Point is where the two rail lines met up. So now we have our first transcontinental railroad. Several more are going to be built in the latter part of the 1800s as well, but this was the first one. The impact of the railroads, they had both positive and negative. Positive, it brought settlers west, it brought more people out west, it allowed Westerners to trade with the East, so products from the West could be sent to the East. As I said, the railroad lines became the largest landowners in the West because they were given by the government, they were given all this free land to develop, and they were responsible for the creation of many towns. Towns often would fight over who would get, who could convince the railroad to build a rail stop in their particular town, to have a railroad station there. So that became big business. Also, a lot of bribes and kind of illegal stuff going on to try to convince the railroad to make a stop in their particular town. But they created many towns because of this. On the negative side, it encouraged the slaughter of the buffalo. There were millions of wild buffalo roaming the central part of the country, but they got in the way of the railroad and the railroad line, so much of the buffalo herds were slaughtered, which accelerated the conflict with the Native Americans because they used the buffalo to survive. The buffalo, in many places, was their main source of food, and with the buffalo herds being diminished, going down, it affected the way of life of the Native Americans. And as I said, we'll be reading about the problems that came about because of that. Next, we have ranching, and ranching becomes big business in the Central Plains as well. Some opportunities. Ranching is possible in places that couldn't support other types of farming. So large ranches became very important. Also, markets in the east existed for beef and for wool from sheep herders. So there was a lot of opportunities to make money with your cattle and with your beef and with your sheep. A lot of hardships, though. Livestock is very susceptible to disease. Whole herds can be wiped out by disease. And you had a problem with farmers because cattle take up a lot of land for grazing. They were running into problems with farmers who needed to fence off their land to protect it from the cattle. So you're going to have issues between the ranchers and the farmers coming up as well. One issue with the cattle ranchers are they had to get their livestock to the railroad lines, and these are the famous cattle trails that were developed during the mid 1800s or 1880s, basically. And these were called cattle kingdoms. You had the large ranches down in the Texas area, and then they would have these long trail drives where they would herd up thousands and thousands of their steers, of their cattle, and have to drive them north up to the railway lines so then they could be shipped back east. Chicago primarily. Chicago was a huge place for slaughterhouses for the beef, for the cattle that were being sent from the Central Plains. So this shows you the more famous um, lines where the cattle drives happened. Eventually, the railroad lines are going to be being built closer and closer to the ranches down in the southern part of Texas. So after about 15, maybe 20 years, these long cattle drives were no longer necessary and they all kind of died out. But this was the period of the cowboy and the cattle hand and the cattle ranches and the Wild West, and all of this is happening in the late 1800s. Next, you had mining. Back in the 1850s, you had the gold strike in California, which brought so many people across the country to California, and that's how California became a state so quickly because of that. But there were also starting to find gold and silver in other places in the country as well, in Colorado and Idaho, Montana, the Dakotas, both north and south. Large gold strikes are being found there. So more and more people are rushing into that area to try to strike it rich. And then also in Nevada, you had silver mining. The Comstock Lode is the famous um, mining area in the upper part of Nevada where silver mining was very profitable there. But everybody wanted to kind of get rich quick and strike it rich, so thousands of mostly men headed for the areas where gold and silver were found. The opportunities, of course, are your chance to get rich, to strike it rich. The hardships, though, very few people actually made those big discoveries, and eventually large corporations began to take over all the mining business. Um, the people who really made money off of mining were the stores and the shopkeepers and the businesses, because they had to sell the products. You need picks and shovels and pans and different types of products to do any kind of mining. So the people who sold those sold them for very high prices. So they were the ones that were really striking it rich. Very few of the actual miners became wealthy because of this. So mining communities, as I said, most miners were men, some were families and single women. Mining camps were usually just a group of tents and shacks, very movable because you wanted to be able to pick up and go to wherever the next strike is found. Some camps, though, grew into towns, and then stores and businesses were settled. Once that happened, more families started to arrive, and once you have families, churches and schools, newspapers, other businesses are not far behind. And then some of these camps actually grew into major cities. Denver, Colorado was one of these, started off as a small mining camp. But as I said, mining is a very difficult business. First you had individual prospectors work the mines with hand tools, but it's very hard work. And eventually, as I said, individual prospectors gave way to big business who took over most of the mining interests. And next you have farming. What does a successful farmer need? He needs land with tillable soil, land that he can plow and plant seeds into. You need adequate rainfall, of course, irrigation. Plants need water to grow. You eventually need access to machinery and supplies. You need plows that are that are very sharp and will be able to plow through the ground deep enough so that you can plant your seeds. You need a way to get your crops to market so that you can make money off of it. And then you need an actual market for the goods to sell. So there were a lot of things that a farmer needed in order to be successful. The hardships, of course, the land in the central part of the United States was very thick sod, and it was actually underneath the sod that the really rich, fertile the ground was for planting, but you had to dig through inches and inches of that very thick sod, which could be very difficult. The central part of the United States had a lack of rainfall. There was often droughts happening. A lot of social isolation. You're in a farm with neighbors being miles away, so you were kind of by yourself a lot, so very difficult. They were often in debt. Crop prices tended to be very low, but it was very costly from the railroads to ship your goods to market. There was also extreme weather. Again, in the Great Plains, you have very hot and dry summers and freezing cold winters, so you had large extremes of temperature going on. And then you have the problem of insects. There were years where crops by the thousands were just decimated by these kind of herds of grasshoppers. By the millions would swarm in and eat up everything in sight, so that was always a problem you had to deal with as well. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, and that encouraged settlement of the Great Plains. And how it worked was, if you were 21 years old, you could stake a claim. You have to file an application, you had to pay a small fee, $10, and then you were given 160 acres of land. And as long as you lived and farmed on it and improved the land for at least 5 years, the land was yours, so you didn't have to pay a lot of money to own the land, but very difficult uh, to make a life off of that. 160 acres is really not a whole lot of land and able to grow enough crops that you can sell and profit from. So again, a very difficult life. If you've heard of the Little House on the Prairie stories and the TV show about Laura Ingalls Wilder, she grew up in this era and wrote stories about her family's experiences and the difficulties they had farming on the Great Plains, and that is all true stuff that came from this era. Another problem you had in the Great Plains was there weren't a lot of trees available for lumber to build your houses, so people built their houses out of the sod. They would cut bricks of sod out of the land and then build their houses. If you look really closely at this picture, a very famous picture from that era, um, those are bricks of sod, dirt basically, that this house is built out of. And you can see that, yes, that is a cow up on top of the roof eating from the grass and things that have grown out of the sod. The problem is, if you can imagine, you have bugs. If it does rain, it becomes very muddy. So, not the ideal way to live. But that's all they had. As I said, there were no forests of trees you could cut down to build your houses out of, so you had to use what was available to you. And what was available was the sod. And these became known as soddies. These people became known as sod busters because they're busting up the sod to make bricks out of to build their houses. But you can see it's got a door and windows, and they made the best of what they had available to them.